A black woman named Jasmine helps a blind old man in a grocery store. The next day, she receives an unexpected surprise that changes her life forever. How will this surprise transform her future? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A 16-year-old black teenager living in a small town named Jasmine woke up to the sound of chirping birds outside her window. The soft morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow on her small bedroom. She sat up and stretched, her eyes falling on the faded photograph beside her bed of her younger self with Mrs. Taylor, the kind-hearted director of the orphanage where she had grown up. With a deep breath, Jasmine swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up. She walked to her dresser and pulled out a simple t-shirt and jeans. As she got dressed, her mind wandered to the orphanage and the little faces she would see today. Another day, she whispered to herself, a mix of hope and uncertainty in her voice. Jasmine made her way downstairs and out the front door of her foster home. The streets were quiet as she walked the familiar path to the orphanage. Her heart lifted a little as the old brick building came into view. As she approached the entrance, she heard the excited squeals of children playing in the yard. A smile spread across her face, warming her from the inside out. "Jasmine!" A chorus of young voices called out as she stepped through the gate. Little arms wrapped around her legs, and Jasmine bent down to hug the children. "Hey everyone! How are you all doing today?" Mrs. Taylor appeared in the doorway, her gray hair neatly pulled back and a gentle smile on her face. "Jasmine, dear, it's so good to see you." Jasmine made her way to the older woman, giving her a warm hug. "Hi, Mrs. Taylor. I thought I'd come by and help out for a bit before school." Mrs. Taylor's eyes crinkled with affection. "You're always welcome here, sweetheart. You know that." As they walked inside together, Mrs. Taylor placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Do you remember when you first came to us? Such a tiny thing, but with the biggest heart I'd ever seen." Jasmine nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "I remember. You've always been there for me." "And look at you now," Mrs. Taylor said softly. "You've overcome so much. I'm so proud of the young woman you've become." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe Mrs. Taylor's words, but doubt crept into her mind. "I don't know, Mrs. Taylor. Sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough, like I should be doing more with my life." Mrs. Taylor squeezed her shoulder gently. "Oh, Jasmine, you make a difference every day, just by being you. These children look up to you so much." Jasmine managed a small smile, but inside she still felt uncertain. Her dream of making a real difference in the world seemed so far away. As she prepared to start another ordinary day, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever find her true purpose. Jasmine stepped out of the orphanage, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She checked her pocket for the crumpled shopping list and some cash her foster mom had given her. With a deep breath, she started walking towards the local grocery store. The streets were bustling with activity as Jasmine made her way down the sidewalk. Cars whizzed by, and people rushed past her, everyone seemingly in a hurry to get somewhere important. Jasmine felt like she was moving in slow motion compared to the world around her. As she entered the grocery store, the cool air-conditioned breeze hit her face. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the aisles stretched out before her like a maze. Jasmine grabbed a small basket and began her hunt for the items on the list. She wandered through the produce section, picking up a bag of apples and some bananas. As she reached for a head of lettuce, her hand brushed against that of a well-dressed woman. "Oh, excuse me," Jasmine mumbled, quickly pulling back. The woman barely glanced at her before grabbing the lettuce and moving on. Jasmine felt a pang in her chest. It was as if she were invisible, just another face in the crowd. As she moved through the aisles, Jasmine's mind drifted to her uncertain future. She watched a mother and daughter arguing over which cereal to buy and felt a twinge of envy. What would it be like to have a real family, to belong somewhere permanently? Jasmine picked up a box of pasta and some sauce, her thoughts turning to the limited opportunities that seemed available to her. College felt like an impossible dream, and she wasn't sure what kind of job she could get without higher education. The weight of her uncertain future pressed down on her shoulders, making the simple task of grocery shopping feel overwhelming. She passed by a group of teenagers laughing and joking around near the snack aisle. They were probably her age, but Jasmine felt years older. Her experiences in the foster care system had forced her to grow up fast, and she often felt out of place among her peers. As Jasmine walked into the snack aisle, she noticed an elderly blind man standing in front of the biscuit section. His thin white hair and kind, wrinkled face made him look gentle, but he seemed frustrated as he tried to find something on the shelves. He was holding a long cane, and it was clear he was struggling. Jasmine felt a tug at her heart and wondered how she could assist him. The blind man's hands moved slowly across the shelves, feeling the different packages. He muttered to himself, "Where are those oatmeal biscuits?" Jasmine watched as he picked up a box, brought it close to his face, and then set it back down with a sigh. Her heart squeezed with sympathy. She knew all too well what it felt like to be lost and struggling. For a moment, Jasmine hesitated. Should she offer to help? What if the man didn't want her assistance? She bit her lip, remembering times when she had felt invisible and unwanted. But then she thought of Mrs. Taylor's words about kindness and making a difference no matter how small. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I noticed you were looking for something. Can I help you find it?" The old blind man turned towards her voice, a look of surprise and relief washing over his face. "Oh, hello there," he said with a warm smile. "That's very kind of you. I'm looking for my favorite oatmeal biscuits. I was assisted on the shelf, but I can't seem to find them." Jasmine felt a shy smile tugging at her lips. "I'd be happy to help you look," she said, her voice growing a little stronger. "What brand are they?" "They're called Golden Oats," the man replied. "They come in a blue box with gold lettering and smooth boxes." Jasmine scanned the shelves, her eyes moving quickly over the colorful packages. After a few moments, she spotted the blue box with Golden Oats, written in shiny gold letters. "I found them," she said, reaching for the box. "They were just a little higher up on the shelf." Jasmine carefully took the box of Golden Oats from the shelf and handed it to Mr. Carter. His face lit up with a warm smile as his fingers traced the familiar packaging. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "These biscuits mean more to me than you might imagine." Jasmine felt a flutter of curiosity. "Really? How come?" she asked softly. Mr. Carter's eyes seemed to look far away, even though they couldn't see. "My late wife, Martha, absolutely loved these biscuits," he began, his voice tender with memory. "Every Sunday afternoon, we'd sit on our porch swing sharing a pack of Golden Oats and a pot of tea." Jasmine listened intently, touched by the fondness in Mr. Carter's voice. She could almost picture the scene he described. "Martha would dunk her biscuit in her tea," Mr. Carter continued, chuckling softly. "She'd always let it soak a bit too long, and it would break off into her cup. We'd laugh about it every time." Jasmine felt a lump forming in her throat. "That sounds really nice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter nodded, his smile bittersweet. "It was. Those were some of the happiest moments of my life. Now, whenever I eat these biscuits, it's like she's right here with me again." Jasmine's heart ached with understanding. She thought of the orphanage, of Mrs. Taylor, and of all the little moments that made her feel at home there. "I know what you mean," she said. "Sometimes it's the little things that bring back the best memories." Mr. Carter turned his face towards her, his expression softening. "You sound like you speak from experience, young lady. Have you lost someone too?" Jasmine hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I never really knew my parents, but the people at the orphanage where I grew up, they're like family to me. When I visit, even the smell of the place brings back so many memories." Mr. Carter reached out and patted Jasmine's hand gently. "Family comes in many forms, doesn't it? It's the love that matters, not the blood." Jasmine felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Yeah, it really does," she agreed, her voice thick with emotion. As Jasmine watched Mr. Carter clutch the box of golden oats to his chest, she felt a warm glow spread through her. It wasn't often that she got to make someone else happy, and the feeling was as sweet as the biscuits themselves. "You've been so kind," Mr. Carter said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "It's not just about the biscuits, you know. It's the time you took to listen to an old man's stories." Jasmine ducked her head, feeling a bit shy. "It was nothing, really," she mumbled, not used to such praise. Mr. Carter shook his head firmly. "No, my dear. It was everything. In this busy world, a moment of kindness is a rare and precious thing." His words touched something deep inside Jasmine. She felt her cheeks grow warm, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "I'm glad I could help," she said softly. As they stood there in the snack aisle, surrounded by colorful packages and the hum of the store, Jasmine felt a strange connection to this kind old man. It was as if, for a brief moment, the invisible wall that usually separated her from the rest of the world had fallen away. Mr. Carter reached out and patted her hand gently. "You have a good heart, young lady. Don't ever lose that." Jasmine nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. She wanted to say more, to tell him how much his words meant to her, but she couldn't find the right words. With a final smile and a nod, Mr. Carter turned and shuffled away, his treasured biscuits tucked safely under his arm. Jasmine watched him go, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a long time. She took a deep breath and turned back to her shopping cart, ready to finish her errands. As she moved through the store, picking up the items on her list, Jasmine found herself smiling more easily. The weight of her worries seemed a little less heavy, and the world around her a little brighter. She couldn't quite explain it, but something about her encounter with Mr. Carter had lifted her spirits. It was just a small act of kindness, she told herself. Nothing special. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was a reminder that she had something valuable to offer the world, even if it was just a moment of compassion. Jasmine stepped through the familiar doors of the orphanage, the scent of chalk and children's laughter filling the air. Her heart lightened as she heard the pitter-patter of little feet rushing towards her. "Jasmine's here," a chorus of young voices called out. She knelt down, opening her arms wide as several children ran to hug her. Their warmth and excitement washed over her, chasing away the lingering doubts that had plagued her earlier. "Hey, kiddos," Jasmine said softly, her smile genuine and bright. "Ready to tackle some homework?" The children nodded eagerly, tugging her towards the study area. Jasmine settled down at a small table, surrounded by a sea of curious faces and open textbooks. As she helped a young girl with her math problems, Jasmine's mind drifted back to her encounter with Mr. Carter. The memory of his kind words and grateful smile made her own smile grow wider. "You look happy today, Jasmine," one of the boys noted. His pencil paused over his workbook. Jasmine nodded, her eyes twinkling. "I am. Want to know why?" The children leaned in, their homework momentarily forgotten. Jasmine began to tell them about her trip to the grocery store and the kind old man she'd met. She described how lost he'd looked, searching for his wife's favorite biscuits, and how good it had felt to help him. "Sometimes," Jasmine said, her voice soft but filled with conviction, "the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference." The children hung on her every word, their eyes wide with wonder. Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest as she looked at their eager faces. She might not have all the answers about her own future, but here in this moment she knew she was making a difference. As the afternoon wore on, Jasmine continued to help with homework, but she also shared more stories and listened to the children's own tales of their day. She laughed at their jokes, comforted their worries, and celebrated their small victories. With each interaction, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose. These children looked up to her, trusted her, and in their eyes, she saw hope. Not just for them, but for herself, too. That evening, Jasmine sat on the edge of her bed in her foster family's home, her mind replaying the day's events. The quiet of her small room enveloped her as she hugged her knees to her chest, lost in thought. She closed her eyes, picturing Mr. Carter's face, the way his face lit up when she found his favorite biscuits, the gentle smile that had spread across his wrinkled features. It was such a small thing, helping an old blind man find a snack, but the warmth it had brought to her heart lingered even now. Jasmine sighed softly, opening her eyes to gaze out the window at the star-studded sky. Was this all her life would ever be? Small moments of kindness, fleeting connections that disappeared as quickly as they came? She longed for something more, something bigger, a chance to truly make her mark on the world. But how could she, Jasmine wondered, when she was just a foster kid from a small town? The odds seemed stacked against her, the path to her dreams unclear and daunting. Yet, as she thought about the children at the orphanage and how they looked up to her, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe these small acts of kindness weren't so insignificant after all. Maybe they were building blocks, stepping stones to something greater. Jasmine's fingers traced patterns on her bedspread as she wrestled with her conflicting emotions. Hope and doubt danced together in her mind, neither quite winning out over the other. She thought about Mr. Carter again, wondering if he was enjoying his biscuits, if her small gesture had brought a bit of comfort to his day. As she prepared for bed, Jasmine's heart felt both heavy and light. Uncertainty about her future weighed on her, but the memory of the smiles she'd brought to others' faces today lifted her spirits. She climbed under the covers, her mind still swirling with thoughts of what might be. The next morning, Jasmine woke to the soft chirping of birds outside her window. She stretched and yawned, her mind still foggy with sleep. As she went through her usual morning routine, she couldn't shake the lingering thoughts from the night before, the mix of hope and uncertainty that had followed her into her dreams. Jasmine made her way to the orphanage, her steps light as she looked forward to seeing the children. But as she approached the familiar building, she noticed Mrs. Taylor standing at the entrance, her face unusually serious. "Jasmine, dear," Mrs. Taylor called out, her voice tight. "Could you come to my office, please?" Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the sudden knot of anxiety in her stomach. What could this be about? Had she done something wrong? As she followed Mrs. Taylor down the hallway, Jasmine's mind raced. She replayed the events of the past few days, searching for any misstep or mistake. The silence between them felt heavy, adding to the growing tension. They entered Mrs. Taylor's office, a room Jasmine had always associated with warmth and guidance. But today, it felt different, colder somehow. Mrs. Taylor sat behind her desk, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Please sit down, Jasmine," Mrs. Taylor said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Jasmine lowered herself into the seat, her legs feeling weak. She clasped her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Mrs. Taylor took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Jasmine's. The seriousness in her gaze made Jasmine's heart pound even harder. Whatever this was about, it was clearly important. "Jasmine," Mrs. Taylor began, her voice steady but grave. "There's something we need to discuss." Mrs. Taylor's expression softened as she looked at Jasmine. "I have some extraordinary news," she said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "The orphanage has just received an anonymous donation. And Jasmine, it's in your name." Jasmine's eyes widened, her mouth falling open in shock. In my name?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor nodded, a smile breaking across her face. "Yes, and it's not just any donation. It's the largest amount we've ever received. More money than we've seen in all the years I've been here." Jasmine felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. How could this be possible? Who would do such a thing? But why me?" Jasmine asked, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. I haven't done anything special." Mrs. Taylor reached across the desk, gently patting Jasmine's hand. "Clearly, someone out there thinks very highly of you, my dear. Someone who believes in you and wants to support not just you, but all the children here." Jasmine's thoughts whirled. She thought of all the faces she'd seen recently. The children at the orphanage, the shoppers at the grocery store, Mr. Carter with his biscuits. Had one of them done this? But how and why? This is It's too much, Jasmine said, feeling overwhelmed. Tears pricked at her eyes, a mix of confusion and gratitude washing over her. I don't deserve this. Oh, Jasmine, Mrs. Taylor said, her voice warm and reassuring. You've always been so quick to help others, so kind and selfless. Perhaps this is the universe's way of giving back to you. Jasmine sat in stunned silence, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. The idea that someone out there, someone she might not even know, thought so highly of her to make such a generous gift was almost too much to comprehend. Jasmine sat in Mrs. Taylor's office, her mind reeling from the news. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a dream, that at any moment she'd wake up and find herself back in her small bedroom, facing another ordinary day. I can't believe it, Jasmine said softly, shaking her head. Are you sure it's not a mistake? Mrs. Taylor smiled gently. No mistake, Jasmine. The donation is real, and it's in your name. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Jasmine's thoughts drifted to the day before. She remembered her encounter with Mr. Carter in the grocery store, how lost he had looked searching for his wife's favorite biscuits. It had been such a small thing, helping him find them, listening to his story. Could that simple act of kindness have led to this? Mrs. Taylor, Jasmine began hesitantly, could it be possible that someone I helped recently did this? The older woman tilted her head, considering. It's certainly possible, Jasmine. Your kindness touches more people than you realize. Jasmine's mind raced with possibilities. She thought of Mr. Carter's grateful smile, the warmth in his eyes as he thanked her. But surely, a stranger wouldn't make such a generous donation based on one small interaction, would they? But who would do something like this? Jasmine wondered aloud. And why me? As she sat there, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the orphanage, Jasmine felt as if her world had suddenly expanded. The future that had once seemed so limited now stretched out before her, full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Yet with those possibilities came questions. Who was this mysterious benefactor? What did they want? And how would this change her life and the lives of the children she cared about so deeply? Jasmine's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She thought of all the children in the orphanage, of how this money could help them. But she also thought of herself, of the dreams she had tucked away, thinking they were out of reach. What happens now? Jasmine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She looked up at Mrs. Taylor, determination shining in her eyes. Mrs. Taylor, is there anything else you can tell me about the donation? Any clue at all? She asked, leaning forward in her chair. The director shook her head, her brow furrowed. I'm afraid not, Jasmine. The only thing we know for certain is that it was made specifically in your name. That's what makes it so unusual. Jasmine nodded slowly, her mind whirling with questions. And you're sure there's no note or message from the donor? Nothing, Mrs. Taylor confirmed. It's as much a mystery to me as it is to you. Jasmine stood up and began to pace the small office, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow connected to her encounter with Mr. Carter. But how could that be? It seemed too incredible to be true. Maybe it was someone from my past? Jasmine wondered aloud. A relative I never knew about? Mrs. Taylor's eyes softened with sympathy. It's possible, but we shouldn't get our hopes up about that. Remember, we've never been able to find any of your relatives. Jasmine nodded, trying to push away the familiar ache that came with thoughts of her unknown family. She turned her mind back to the mystery at hand. What if it was someone I helped recently? She mused. Like Mr. Carter from the grocery store? The elderly gentleman you told me about? Mrs. Taylor asked. It seems unlikely that a stranger would make such a large donation based on one interaction, but I suppose anything's possible. Jasmine's mind raced with other possibilities. Could it be someone from school? A secret millionaire who had been watching her? Each idea seemed more far-fetched than the last, but she couldn't help herself. The mystery of it all was both exciting and overwhelming. "I just can't believe someone would do this for me," Jasmine said softly, more to herself than to Mrs. Taylor. "Why me?" Mrs. Taylor stood up and placed a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Because you're special, Jasmine. You have a kind heart and a giving spirit. Someone clearly saw that in you and wanted to help." Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest at Mrs. Taylor's words. She might not know who the mysterious donor was, but their belief in her made her feel valued in a way she never had before. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Carter was somehow connected to the mysterious donation. With determination in her step, she made her way to the grocery store where they had met. Her heart raced with anticipation as she pushed through the automatic doors. The familiar aisles stretched out before her, filled with shoppers going about their day. Jasmine's eyes scanned each face, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Carter's kind smile. She retraced her steps to the snack aisle where they had first met, but found only strangers browsing the shelves. Undeterred, Jasmine began a systematic search of the store. She walked up and down each aisle, her gaze darting from person to person. The bakery, the produce section, even the frozen foods. She left no area unexplored. But Mr. Carter was nowhere to be found. As time passed, Jasmine's hope began to fade. She approached a young cashier, mustering her courage to ask about Mr. Carter. "Excuse me," Jasmine said softly. "I'm looking for an elderly gentleman who shops here. He has white hair and likes a specific brand of biscuits. Have you seen him recently?" The cashier furrowed her brow, thinking for a moment. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I've seen anyone matching that description. We get a lot of customers, though. Maybe try asking our manager." Jasmine nodded, thanking the cashier before seeking out the store manager. She repeated her question, providing as much detail as she could remember about Mr. Carter. But the manager's response was equally disappointing. "I'm afraid I can't help you, miss," he said with an apologetic smile. "We respect our customers' privacy, and I don't recall anyone specific matching that description." Deflated, Jasmine thanked him and made her way to the exit. She stood just outside the store, watching people come and go, hoping against hope that Mr. Carter might appear. But as the minutes ticked by, she had to face the truth. Mr. Carter seemed to have vanished without a trace. As Jasmine walked away from the grocery store, her mind swirled with thoughts about Mr. Carter and the mysterious donation. Though her search had come up empty, something inside her had changed. The idea that someone out there believed in her enough to make such a generous gift began to take root in her heart. For the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt a spark of hope ignite within her. She found herself standing a little taller as she made her way back to the orphanage. The weight of invisibility that had always seemed to press down on her shoulders began to lift ever so slightly. As she helped Mrs. Taylor sort through some paperwork related to the donation, Jasmine caught a glimpse of her reflection in the office window. She paused, really looking at herself. The girl staring back at her wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. She was someone who had inspired an act of incredible kindness. "You know, Jasmine," Mrs. Taylor said, noticing her distraction, "whoever made this donation must have seen something truly special in you." Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest at Mrs. Taylor's words. "Do you really think so?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor nodded, her eyes twinkling. "I've always known you were special, dear. It's wonderful to see someone else recognize it, too." Those words echoed in Jasmine's mind as she went about her day. When she visited the younger children at the orphanage, she found herself speaking with more confidence. She shared stories of kindness and encouraged the kids to believe in themselves, just as someone had believed in her. As the days passed, Jasmine began to see herself differently. She wasn't just a girl from the orphanage anymore. She was someone capable of inspiring others, of making a real difference in the world. The change was subtle, but it was there, in the way she carried herself, in the warmth of her smile, in the gentle assurance of her voice when she spoke to others. Jasmine found herself drawn to the orphanage more and more in the days following the mysterious donation. The old building, once a symbol of her uncertain past, now felt like a canvas of possibility. She eagerly threw herself into the renovation plans, her eyes lighting up as she discussed color schemes and furniture layouts with Mrs. Taylor. "What do you think about turning the old storage room into a study area?" Jasmine suggested one afternoon, her voice filled with newfound confidence. Mrs. Taylor beamed at her. "That's a wonderful idea, Jasmine. Why don't you take charge of that project?" The responsibility thrilled Jasmine. She spent hours poring over catalogs, carefully selecting desks and bookshelves that would create a warm, inviting space for the children to learn and grow. As she worked, she found herself sharing her ideas with the younger kids, their excited chatter filling the halls. Little Sarah, a shy 7-year-old, tugged on Jasmine's sleeve one day. "Can I help you paint, Jasmine? Pretty, please?" Jasmine's heart swelled with affection. "Of course you can, sweetie. We'll make it beautiful together." As the weeks passed, Jasmine noticed a change in how the children looked at her. Their eyes shone with admiration, and they hung on her every word. She overheard one of the boys telling a new arrival, "When I grow up, I want to be just like Jasmine." The comment stopped Jasmine in her tracks. She'd never thought of herself as someone to look up to before. But as she watched the children eagerly pitch in with the renovations, mimicking her enthusiasm and care, she realized she had become a role model without even trying. This realization filled Jasmine with a warm glow of pride and purpose. She stood a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, and approached each task with renewed determination. The orphanage was transforming, and so was she. Despite her growing confidence, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was incomplete. The mysterious donation had changed her life, but she felt a deep need to thank her benefactor. With determination in her heart, she found herself returning to the grocery store time and time again, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Carter. Each visit brought a flicker of hope, only to end in disappointment. Jasmine would wander the aisles, her eyes scanning every face, her heart leaping at the sight of any elderly gentleman. But Mr. Carter remained elusive, like a ghost that had touched her life and vanished. As weeks turned into months, Jasmine's search became more than just about finding Mr. Carter. It evolved into a quest for understanding her own worth. She found herself lingering in the snack aisle where she had first met him, replaying their conversation in her mind. "Why me?" she would whisper to herself, staring at the shelf of biscuits. "What did he see in me that I couldn't see in myself?" These questions echoed in her mind as she helped customers who reminded her of Mr. Carter. Each act of kindness, no matter how small, felt like a tribute to the man who had believed in her. She began to see her own actions through his eyes, recognizing the value in her compassion and willingness to help others. One particularly quiet afternoon, as Jasmine stood in the familiar snack aisle, an elderly woman approached her. "Excuse me, dear," the woman said softly. "Could you help me reach that top shelf?" Jasmine smiled warmly, her heart swelling with a familiar feeling. As she stretched to grab the item, she caught her reflection in the store's security mirror. For a moment, she saw herself as Mr. Carter must have seen her, kind, capable, and full of potential. In that instant, Jasmine realized that her search for Mr. Carter had led her to something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of herself. She may never find him again, but his impact on her life was undeniable and lasting. As the sun peeked through the dusty windows of the orphanage, Jasmine found herself in a small storage room, sorting through old boxes and forgotten items. The renovation project was in full swing, and every corner of the building was being cleaned and updated. Jasmine hummed softly to herself, feeling a sense of purpose as she worked. Her hands brushed against something smooth and flat tucked away in the corner. Curious, she pulled it out, revealing an old photograph in a simple wooden frame. As she wiped away the dust with her sleeve, her heart skipped a beat. There, smiling back at her, was a face she recognized instantly: Mr. Carter. "Oh my goodness," Jasmine whispered, her eyes wide with surprise. The photograph showed a much younger Mr. Carter, his arm wrapped lovingly around a beautiful woman. They stood in front of a small house, their faces beaming with joy. Jasmine's fingers trembled as she traced the outline of their faces. "It must be his wife," she said softly, remembering the story Mr. Carter had shared about his late wife's love for biscuits. Jasmine's mind raced with questions. How did this photo end up here? What connection did Mr. Carter have to the orphanage? Could this be the key to understanding the mysterious donation? She carefully turned the frame over, hoping to find some clue on the back. A small inscription caught her eye. To my dearest Margaret, may our love always have a home. Love, Edward. Edward, Jasmine repeated, finally knowing Mr. Carter's first name. The word home struck a chord in her heart, making her wonder if the orphanage held some special meaning for Mr. Carter and his wife. Clutching the photograph to her chest, Jasmine felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This discovery could be the missing piece she'd been searching for. It might explain why Mr. Carter had chosen to make such a generous donation in her name. With renewed determination, Jasmine stood up, her mind already forming a plan. She needed to show this to Mrs. Taylor. Perhaps together they could unravel the mystery that had been puzzling them for months. Jasmine clutched the photograph tightly as she hurried down the hallway, her heart pounding with excitement. She found Mrs. Taylor in her office poring over renovation plans. "Mrs. Taylor," Jasmine said, slightly out of breath, "I found something important." Mrs. Taylor looked up, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. "What is it, dear?" Jasmine carefully placed the photograph on the desk. "I think this might help us understand the donation." Mrs. Taylor's eyes widened as she picked up the frame. She adjusted her glasses and peered closely at the image. A soft gasp escaped her lips. "Oh my," she whispered. "It's Edward Carter and his wife, Margaret." Jasmine's heart leaped. "You know them?" Mrs. Taylor nodded, a fond smile spreading across her face. "Mr. Carter has been a supporter of our orphanage for many years. Such a kind man, always thinking of the children." "Really?" Jasmine leaned in, eager to hear more. "Oh yes," Mrs. Taylor continued, her eyes misty with memories. "He and Margaret would visit occasionally, bringing small gifts and spending time with the children. Their donations were modest, but their hearts were always in the right place." Jasmine felt a warmth spreading through her chest. "Did they have children of their own?" Mrs. Taylor shook her head. "No, they didn't. But they cared deeply for all children, especially those without families. I think, in a way, the children here became their family." As Mrs. Taylor spoke, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Jasmine's mind. The connection between Mr. Carter and the orphanage, his kindness towards her in the store, and now this generous donation. It all started to make sense. "Mrs. Taylor," Jasmine said softly, "I think Mr. Carter might be our anonymous donor." Mrs. Taylor looked at Jasmine thoughtfully. "You know, dear, I think you might be right. It would be just like Edward to do something so generous, especially if he was touched by an act of kindness." Jasmine's mind raced back to that day in the grocery store, remembering the warmth in Mr. Carter's face as she helped him find his wife's favorite biscuits. She felt a surge of emotion, realizing how much impact a simple act of kindness could have. "But why me?" Jasmine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor reached out and patted Jasmine's hand. "Sometimes, dear, we touch people's lives in ways we can't even imagine. Your kindness must have meant a great deal to Mr. Carter." As the days passed, the orphanage began to transform. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new furniture replaced the old worn-out pieces, and the playground equipment sparkled in the sunlight. Jasmine found herself at the heart of these changes, her enthusiasm infectious as she helped coordinate volunteers and offered input on the improvements. One afternoon, as Jasmine was helping to arrange books in the newly renovated library, Mrs. Taylor approached her with an envelope in hand. "Jasmine, dear," Mrs. Taylor said, her eyes twinkling with excitement, "I have some news for you." Jasmine set down the book she was holding and turned to face Mrs. Taylor. "What is it?" Mrs. Taylor handed her the envelope. "You've been invited to speak at the upcoming community event. They want you to share your experiences growing up here at the orphanage." Jasmine's eyes widened as she read the invitation. Her heart began to race, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through her veins. "Me? Speak in front of people?" Mrs. Taylor nodded encouragingly. "Yes, you. They've heard about your involvement in the renovations and how you've been such an inspiration to the younger children." Jasmine's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt a surge of pride at being recognized. On the other, the thought of standing in front of a crowd made her palms sweat. I don't know if I can do this, Jasmine stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor placed a gentle hand on Jasmine's shoulder. I understand it's scary, dear, but I believe in you. This could be a wonderful opportunity for you to share your story and inspire others. Jasmine bit her lip, considering Mrs. Taylor's words. She thought about all the changes that had happened recently. The anonymous donation, her growing confidence, and the positive impact she'd been making at the orphanage. Do you really think I'm ready for something like this? Jasmine asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Mrs. Taylor's smile was warm and reassuring. I know you are, Jasmine. You've grown so much, and your story is powerful. It could make a real difference to others who might be struggling. Jasmine took a deep breath, feeling a small spark of courage ignite within her. Maybe this was another step on her journey, another chance to make a difference. Okay, she said softly, a tentative smile forming on her lips. I'll do it. I'll give the speech. As the day of the community event arrived, Jasmine stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched her notes tightly, her palms damp with nervous sweat. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, families, community leaders, and even some of the children from the orphanage. Mrs. Taylor gave Jasmine a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before gently nudging her towards the stage. You've got this, she whispered. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine stepped out into the spotlight. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on her. For a moment, she felt frozen, but then she caught sight of the younger children from the orphanage, their faces beaming with pride. It was then that Jasmine found her voice. Hello, she began, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each word. My name is Jasmine, and I grew up in the local orphanage. As she spoke, Jasmine's nerves began to melt away. She shared stories of her childhood, the challenges she faced, and the moments of joy she found even in difficult times. Her words painted a vivid picture of life in the orphanage, touching the hearts of everyone in the room. When she reached the part about the anonymous donation, Jasmine's voice filled with emotion. This act of kindness changed everything, she said, her eyes glistening. It showed me that one person can make a difference, that small acts of kindness can ripple out and touch so many lives. The audience hung on her every word, many wiping away tears. Jasmine could feel the connection she was making, the impact her story was having. It was a feeling unlike anything she had ever experienced before. As she concluded her speech, the room erupted in applause. Jasmine stood there, overwhelmed by the response. She saw Mrs. Taylor in the back of the room, beaming with pride. The younger children from the orphanage were cheering loudly, their faces lit up with admiration. In that moment, something shifted inside Jasmine. She realized that her story, her experiences, had the power to inspire others. The sense of purpose she had been searching for suddenly became clear. This was how she could make a difference in the world, by sharing her journey and inspiring others to persevere, to be kind, to believe in the power of small actions. After the event, Jasmine found herself surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. As she made her way through the crowd, a woman with a friendly smile and a notepad approached her. Jasmine, hi, I'm Sarah from the local newspaper. The woman introduced herself. Your speech was incredibly moving. I'd love to write a story about you and the orphanage's transformation. Would you be interested in an interview? Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise. She had never been interviewed before, and the idea both excited and intimidated her. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. Yes, I'd like that, she said softly. It could help more people understand what the orphanage means to our community. Over the next few days, Jasmine met with Sarah several times. They talked about Jasmine's life at the orphanage, the anonymous donation, and the changes that were happening. Jasmine shared stories of the children, the dedicated staff, and her own journey of self-discovery. When the article was published, it created quite a stir in the community. People who had never given much thought to the orphanage before were now talking about it. The story highlighted Jasmine's role in the orphanage's revitalization, portraying her as a young leader making a difference. The increased attention brought more volunteers to the orphanage. Local businesses started reaching out, offering donations and support. Jasmine found herself fielding calls and emails from people wanting to help or learn more about her story. At first, the attention overwhelmed Jasmine. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. But as she saw how the story was inspiring others to get involved and make a difference, she began to embrace her new role. She realized that by sharing her experiences, she was giving a voice to all the children at the orphanage. The story's impact continued to grow. Other local media outlets picked it up, and soon Jasmine was invited to speak at schools and community events. Each time she shared her story, she felt more confident and more certain of her purpose. As the story of Jasmine and the orphanage spread, her life began to change in ways she never imagined. The local newspaper article had sparked a wave of interest and support that seemed to grow with each passing day. Donations started pouring into the orphanage, ranging from small personal contributions to substantial gifts from local businesses. Mrs. Taylor was overwhelmed by the community's response. "Jasmine," she said one afternoon, her eyes glistening with tears, "look at what you've started. We can finally give these children the resources they deserve." Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of pride and disbelief. She had never thought her simple act of kindness could lead to such a profound change. As word of her story spread, Jasmine found herself invited to speak at various events. Schools, community centers, and even a local TEDx conference reached out, eager to hear her inspiring journey. At first, the thought of speaking in front of large audiences terrified her. But with each event, she found her voice growing stronger, her message clearer. During one particularly moving speech at a high school, Jasmine looked out at the sea of faces and saw herself reflected in their eyes. Young people full of potential, just waiting for someone to believe in them. It was in that moment that she truly began to believe in her own potential and the difference she could make in the world. Her foster parents noticed the change in her too. "You're walking taller these days," her foster mother remarked one evening. "It's like you've found your purpose." Jasmine smiled, realizing the truth in those words. She had found a purpose, a way to make a real difference in the lives of others. Yet amidst all the positive changes, one thing continued to nag at Jasmine's mind: the mystery of the anonymous donor. Who was this person who had set all of this in motion with their generous gift? Was it really Mr. Carter, as she suspected? The unanswered questions left a small gap in her newfound confidence, a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. One sunny afternoon, as Jasmine walked through town, her mind still buzzing with thoughts of the mysterious donation, she spotted a familiar figure. There, sitting on a park bench near the orphanage, was Mr. Carter, sitting calmly on a bench. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. After weeks of searching, here he was, calm and serene, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. "Mr. Carter," she exclaimed, quickening her pace, "I've been hoping to see you again." The elderly blind man's smile widened. "Well, hello there, Jasmine. What a pleasant surprise. Would you care to join me?" Jasmine nodded eagerly and sat down beside him. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the leaves rustle in the gentle breeze. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine cautiously broached the subject that had been consuming her thoughts. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to ask you about something. The orphanage received a large donation recently, and I couldn't help but wonder." She trailed off, unsure how to continue. Mr. Carter turned to her, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of wisdom and mischief. He simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying his involvement. "You know, Jasmine," he began, turning his head slightly in her direction, though his eyes couldn't meet hers. "The greatest gift I could ever receive was seeing someone with a heart like yours make a difference in the world." Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she was about to say that she hadn't done anything special when he continued. "I can't visually see things," he said, tapping his cane lightly on the floor, "but I can see through you that you are a kind person. Your actions speak louder than sight. You didn't just help me find the biscuits, you showed me that kindness still exists, and that means more to me than anything." Jasmine was struck by the sincerity in his voice. She had always believed that small acts of kindness mattered, but hearing it put into words like this made it feel even more significant. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back, not wanting to show how deeply his words had touched her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "That means a lot to me." The old man smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Keep being who you are, Jasmine. The world needs more people like you." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat, touched by his words. Mr. Carter continued, "Sometimes, a small act of kindness can set off a chain of events that changes lives. You've done that, my dear. You've brought hope and inspiration to so many." Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes as she listened to Mr. Carter's heartfelt words. Whether or not he was the donor, she realized that he had given her something far more valuable than money. He had helped her see her own worth and potential. Mr. Carter's words left Jasmine feeling both satisfied and more curious. She sat there, taking in the weight of his wisdom, feeling a deep connection with this kind elderly man who had unknowingly changed her life. "Mr. Carter," Jasmine said softly, her voice filled with emotion, "I want to thank you. Whether you're the donor or not, you've had such an impact on my life. That day in the grocery store, it wasn't just about the biscuits, it was about feeling seen, feeling like I mattered." Mr. Carter smiled warmly, patting her hand gently. "My dear, you've always mattered. Sometimes we just need a little reminder of our own worth." Jasmine nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I've learned so much since that day. About myself, about the power of kindness. It's like you opened a door I didn't even know was there." "Doors are funny things," Mr. Carter chuckled. "Sometimes we don't see them until someone else points them out. But once we do, it's up to us to walk through them." As they sat there, the afternoon sun warming their faces, Jasmine felt a sense of peace wash over her. The mystery of the donation suddenly seemed less important. She realized that the true gift she had received wasn't the money at all. It was the belief in herself that had blossomed from that simple act of kindness. "You know," Jasmine said, her voice stronger now, "I used to think I needed to know who the donor was to properly thank them. But I think I understand now. The best way to show gratitude is to keep spreading kindness, isn't it?" Mr. Carter's face lit up with a proud smile. "Now you're getting it, Jasmine. That's exactly right." As Jasmine stood to leave, she felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The mystery might remain unsolved, but she was at peace with that. She had found something far more valuable, a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of her own potential. As the orphanage renovations neared completion, Jasmine found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The once dilapidated building now stood proud, its fresh paint gleaming in the sunlight. Inside, new furniture and bright decorations filled the rooms, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. Mrs. Tyler approached Jasmine one afternoon, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Jasmine, dear," she said, "we'd like you to cut the ribbon at the reopening ceremony. You've been such an integral part of this transformation." Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? Really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor nodded, smiling warmly. "You've grown into a true leader, Jasmine. The children look up to you, and the community respects you. It's only fitting that you do the honors." As the day of the ceremony arrived, Jasmine stood before the newly renovated orphanage, her heart pounding with a mix of nervousness and pride. A crowd had gathered, familiar faces from the community, local officials, and most importantly, the children she had grown to love. With shaking hands, Jasmine took the oversized scissors. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze landing on the children. Their eyes shone with excitement and hope, reminding her of herself not so long ago. As she cut the ribbon, cheers erupted from the crowd. Jasmine's heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of joy and accomplishment. She watched as the children rushed inside, their laughter echoing through the halls. Walking through the building, Jasmine saw the impact of their hard work. The library was filled with new books, The playroom burst with colorful toys, and the bedrooms looked cozy and inviting. But more than the physical changes, she saw the change in the children's faces. They were smiling, full of hope and possibility. Jasmine realized that she had become part of something much bigger than herself. She had helped create an environment where children, just like her, could thrive and dream of a brighter future. The reopening ceremony was a grand success, drawing a crowd larger than Jasmine could have ever imagined. Community members, local officials, and even media crews filled the orphanage's newly renovated courtyard. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. As Jasmine stood near the podium, she caught sight of familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Taylor beamed with pride, and the children from the orphanage waved enthusiastically. Even Mr. Carter was there, standing quietly at the back with a gentle smile on his face. When it was time for Jasmine to speak, she approached the microphone with a confidence she had never felt before. Her voice, once timid and unsure, now rang out clear and strong. "This place," she began, gesturing to the building behind her, "is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a home, a haven, and now, a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together." As Jasmine shared her story and the journey of the orphanage's transformation, she saw tears in the eyes of many listeners. Her words touched hearts and inspired minds. She spoke of the power of small acts of kindness and how they could ripple out to create massive change. After the ceremony, people flocked to congratulate Jasmine. Local news reporters requested interviews, community leaders praised her efforts, and children looked at her with admiration in their eyes. Jasmine felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of purpose and belonging she had never experienced before. As the day wound down, Jasmine found a quiet moment to reflect. She looked out over the renovated orphanage, now bustling with life and laughter. For the first time, she allowed herself to envision a future filled with possibilities. She saw herself continuing to make a difference, not just in this small town, but perhaps on an even larger scale. The shy, uncertain girl who once felt invisible now stood tall, her head held high. Jasmine's confidence soared as she realized that she had the power to shape her own destiny and to positively impact the lives of others. The future, once a source of anxiety and doubt, now beckoned with promise and potential. After the ceremony, Jasmine retreated to her room, her heart full and her mind buzzing with the day's events. As she sat on her bed, still dressed in her best clothes, she noticed an envelope on her nightstand. It was crisp and white, with her name written in elegant handwriting. Curious, Jasmine picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, neatly folded. As she unfolded the paper, her hands trembled slightly with anticipation. Her eyes scanned the first few lines and her breath caught in her throat. The letter was from the anonymous donor. Jasmine's heart raced as she read on. "Dear Jasmine, your kindness in the grocery store that day touched my heart more than you could ever know. In that simple act of helping an old man find his favorite biscuits, you showed a compassion and empathy that is rare in this world. I want you to know that the donation made to the orphanage was indeed in your name. Your selfless act inspired me to make a difference, just as you had done for me. Jasmine, you have a special gift. Your ability to see the best in others and to offer help without hesitation is truly remarkable. I hope this letter encourages you to continue following your heart. Never doubt the power of your actions, for they can change lives in ways you may never fully realize. The world needs more people like you, Jasmine. Keep shining your light, and know that your kindness ripples out far beyond what you can see. With deepest gratitude and admiration, a friend." Tears welled up in Jasmine's eyes as she finished reading. She clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what she had suspected but hardly dared to believe. The anonymous donor had been touched by her simple act of kindness in the grocery store. Jasmine's mind whirled with emotions, gratitude, amazement, and a newfound sense of purpose. The letter had not only confirmed the source of the donation, but had also affirmed her worth and the impact of her actions. Jasmine read the letter again, her fingers tracing the words on the page. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but these were tears of joy and overwhelming gratitude. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a sense of validation and purpose that she had never experienced before. As she sat there, clutching the letter, Jasmine realized something profound. The money from the donation had certainly helped the orphanage, but it wasn't the most important part of this journey. It was her character, her kindness, and her willingness to help others that had truly made the difference. She thought back to that day in the grocery store, remembering how small and insignificant she had felt. Yet that simple act of helping Mr. Carter had set off a chain of events that had changed not only her life, but the lives of so many others. Jasmine carefully folded the letter and held it close to her heart. She knew at that moment that she would keep this letter forever. It would serve as a reminder of the power of small acts of kindness and the impact they could have on the world. She stood up and walked to her dresser, opening the top drawer. Inside was a small, ornate box that Mrs. Taylor had given her for her 16th birthday. Jasmine gently placed the letter inside the box, treating it like the treasure it was. As she closed the drawer, Jasmine felt a new sense of purpose washing over her. She realized that she didn't need grand gestures or lots of money to make a difference. Her own actions, no matter how small they might seem, had the power to create ripples of change. Jasmine looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not just the shy girl from the orphanage, but a young woman capable of inspiring others and making a real difference in the world. She smiled, feeling a newfound confidence and determination. With the mystery of the anonymous donor solved, Jasmine felt a new sense of purpose and direction. She no longer saw herself as just a girl from the orphanage, but as someone who could make a real difference in her community. The letter she had received became a constant source of inspiration, reminding her of the power of kindness and the impact of small actions. Jasmine began to think about her future and how she could continue to help others. She realized that her experiences and the recent events had given her a unique perspective that could be valuable to her community. With newfound confidence, she decided to reach out to local leaders and organizations to discuss potential projects. One sunny afternoon, Jasmine met with the mayor and several community board members at the town hall. As she walked into the meeting room, she felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. The old Jasmine might have shrunk away from such an important gathering, but now she stood tall, ready to share her ideas. "Thank you all for meeting with me," Jasmine began, her voice steady and clear. "I've seen firsthand how small acts of kindness can create big changes, and I want to explore ways we can encourage more of that in our community." The mayor leaned forward, intrigued. "What did you have in mind, Jasmine?" Jasmine took a deep breath and shared her ideas. She proposed a mentorship program that would pair older teens with younger children in the community, similar to what she had done at the orphanage. She also suggested organizing regular community service days where people could come together to help those in need. As she spoke, Jasmine could see the local leaders nodding and smiling. They asked questions and offered suggestions, building on her ideas. The meeting, which Jasmine had feared might be intimidating, turned into an exciting brainstorming session. By the end of the meeting, Jasmine felt a surge of excitement. The mayor had agreed to support her initiatives, and several board members had volunteered to help get the projects off the ground. As she left the town hall, Jasmine couldn't help but feel proud of herself and hopeful for the future. Jasmine walked through the doors of the orphanage, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. The familiar scent of cleaning supplies and home-cooked meals greeted her, but something felt different now. As she made her way down the hallway, she noticed the curious eyes of the younger children following her every move. "Jasmine!" a small voice called out. It was Lily, one of the youngest girls at the orphanage. She ran up to Jasmine, her pigtails bouncing with each step. "Did you really talk to the mayor?" Jasmine smiled warmly, kneeling down to Lily's level. "I sure did, sweetie. We talked about ways to make our community even better." A group of children gathered around Jasmine, their eyes wide with admiration. She looked at their faces, remembering how not too long ago she had been just like them, uncertain about her place in the world, and longing for guidance. As Jasmine sat down in the common room surrounded by eager faces, she couldn't help but reflect on her journey. It seemed like only yesterday she was helping Mr. Carter find his biscuits in the grocery store. That simple act of kindness had set off a chain of events that transformed not only her life, but the lives of everyone at the orphanage. "Tell us about the meeting, Jasmine!" another child exclaimed. Jasmine began to share her experience, watching as the children hung on her every word. She saw hope in their eyes, the same hope that had been ignited in her own heart. As she spoke, she realized the profound responsibility she now carried. These children looked up to her as a mentor and a leader. They saw in her what she had once struggled to see in herself: strength, kindness, and the power to make a difference. Jasmine felt a deep sense of duty to guide them, to show them that their circumstances didn't define their worth or their potential. As the evening wore on and the children began to disperse for dinner, Jasmine found a quiet moment to herself. She looked around the orphanage, taking in the freshly painted walls and new furniture made possible by the anonymous donation. But more than the physical changes, she saw the change in the children's spirits. In that moment, Jasmine made a silent promise to herself and to the children. She would always be there for them, just as others had been there for her when she needed it most. She would be the mentor she wished she had had growing up, showing them that kindness and perseverance could open doors they never knew existed. Jasmine stood outside the newly renovated orphanage, her eyes taking in the fresh paint and gleaming windows. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the building that had been her home for so many years. As she gazed at the structure, she couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed, not just the building, but her life as well. She thought back to that day in the grocery store when she felt invisible, just another face